Let me say this clean so there's no confusion. If you think the modern world started in Europe, you started the story way too late. I'm serious. You didn't just miss a chapter. You skipped the entire foundation. Because long before Europe was building empires, long before the Renaissance, long before people were talking about Western civilization like it came out of nowhere, Africa was already moving, and not just moving, leading. Now, I'm not talking about some vague, ancient history people throw around to sound deep. I'm talking about real systems, real cities, real knowledge, the kind of stuff that actually builds civilizations. Let's get straight to it. While parts of Europe were still dealing with fragmented kingdoms and constant instability, you had African societies building structured states, trade networks, and knowledge systems that stretched across continents. Not villages, not small communities, empires, organized, connected, and wealthy. And I need you to hear that last part clearly, wealthy, because that changes everything. See, when people picture Africa in history, they've been trained to imagine struggle. But that image doesn't match the reality of multiple periods in time. There were regions in Africa controlling trade routes so valuable that entire economies depended on them. Gold, salt, ivory, resources that powered global trade. And guess who was sitting right in the middle of that? West Africa. Now, think about that for a second. If you control the flow of resources that other regions need, you're not behind, you're central. That's power. Now let's zoom in a little, because this isn't just about resources, it's about systems. You don't move that kind of wealth without organization, without structure, without knowledge. You need administration, you need logistics, you need people who understand how to manage scale. And that was happening at a high level. Now here's where it starts getting interesting, because while all of this is happening, connections are being built across North Africa, into the Middle East, into Europe. Trade isn't just moving goods, it's moving ideas, mathematics, science, philosophy, architecture, all traveling along the same routes. And Africa is part of that network, not outside of it. Now let's talk about knowledge, because this is the part people really don't get taught properly. There were centers of learning in Africa that people traveled to on purpose, not by accident. Places where scholars gathered, where texts were studied, where ideas were exchanged. And no, I'm not talking about one or two isolated examples. I'm talking about entire intellectual environments. That's a different level. Now imagine this. You've got wealth flowing through trade. You've got structured societies managing that wealth. And you've got knowledge systems developing alongside it. That's not random. That's a civilization operating at scale. Now here's where the story usually gets twisted, because when people finally do hear about this, it's treated like a side note, like a fun fact, something extra, not something foundational. And that's the problem, because when you treat the foundation like an extra, you don't understand the structure. Now let's bring Europe into this, but properly. Europe didn't develop in isolation. That's a myth. It was connected to Africa, to the Middle East, to Asia, through trade, through conflict, through exchange. So when Europe starts rising later on, it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a world that already has systems in place, knowledge already moving, resources already circulating, and Africa is part of that system. That's the piece people miss. Now let's keep it real. Does that mean everything came from Africa? No. History doesn't work like that. Different regions contributed different things at different times. But what it does mean is this: the story you were given is incomplete. And once you start filling in those missing pieces, the whole picture changes. Now, here's the part that should really make you stop. Because if Africa was already operating at that level, if it was already part of global systems of trade and knowledge, then the question becomes, why does the story we hear today start somewhere else? Why does it feel like everything begins in Europe? That's not an accident. That's a choice, a narrative choice. And once you start questioning that narrative, you start seeing gaps everywhere. And those gaps, they matter because they shape how people understand the world. Who gets credit? Who gets remembered? And who gets overlooked? Now, we're just getting started because this next part is where things really shift. We're going to look at how knowledge actually moved, who interacted with who, and how certain ideas that get labeled Western didn't start where people think they did. And once you see that, you're not going to look at history the same way again. Let me tell you something straight. Knowledge doesn't care about borders. It moves, always has, always will. So when you hear people talk like ideas just popped up in one place out of nowhere, that should already sound off to you because that's not how the world works. Now picture this. You've got trade routes stretching across North Africa, caravans moving for weeks, months, not just carrying gold and salt, carrying information, scholars, books, languages, ideas moving from one region to another like a current you can't see, but you can feel. And Africa is right in the middle of that flow. Not watching, participating. Now let's talk about these learning centers again, but sharper this time. Because this isn't just people studying, this is organized intellectual life. Libraries, collections of texts, scholars debating, writing, teaching, and people traveling long distances just to be part of that. You don't do that unless something valuable is happening there. Now here's the key. Those ideas didn't stay put. They moved north into places that later became major centers of European learning. And when they got there, they didn't arrive empty. They came with content, mathematics, astronomy, medical knowledge, philosophical frameworks. And over time, those ideas get translated, adapted, built on, and eventually rebranded. That's the part people don't say out loud. Now let's slow that down so it lands. When knowledge moves from one place to another and then gets developed further, who gets the credit? The origin or the expansion? Yes, because history has a habit of remembering the expansion more than the origin, especially when power shifts. Now, don't get it twisted. Europe contributed, absolutely. Built on things, advanced things, created new systems, no argument there. But the idea that it all started there, that's where things fall apart. Now let's talk about language for a second, because this is subtle, but it matters. When something is labeled Western knowledge, what does that actually mean? Does it mean it was created there? Or does it mean it was documented there? Because those are two different things. And once you start asking that question, you start noticing something. A lot of what gets labeled one way has roots that stretch further back, further south, further east, connected through networks people don't talk about enough. Now let's bring it back to the real world. You've got African scholars engaging with ideas coming from the Middle East. You've got those same ideas moving into Europe. You've got translation movements happening, people taking texts and rewriting them in different languages, Latin, Arabic, local dialects, knowledge changing form as it moves, but still carrying the same core ideas. That's how civilizations actually develop. through exchange, not isolation. Now, here's where it gets interesting again, because once Europe starts gaining more political and military power later on, the narrative starts shifting. And this happens quietly, not overnight, gradually. The focus moves, the spotlight moves, and over time, people start telling the story like that's where everything began, not where it passed through, not where it was influenced, where it began. And if you weren't paying attention, you'd think that was true. Now let's keep it real. Most people aren't digging through historical texts. They're getting summaries, simplified versions, clean stories. And in those stories, details get lost, connections get cut, origins get blurred. Now imagine building your entire understanding of the world on a version like that. You're going to miss a lot. Not because because the information was filtered before it got to you. Now let's zoom out again, because this isn't just about who did what. It's about understanding how influence actually works. Influence isn't always loud. Sometimes it's embedded inside systems, inside ideas, inside things people take for granted. And once it's embedded, people stop questioning where it came from. Now think about that in terms of knowledge. If a concept gets passed down, translated, taught, and normalized over generations, at what point do people stop asking where it started? Usually pretty early. Now bring Africa back into the picture, because if it was part of those early networks, if it was producing knowledge, participating in exchange, influencing systems, then its role doesn't disappear just because the spotlight moved. It just becomes less visible. And that's a different problem, because when something becomes less visible, people start acting like it wasn't there at all. Now, here's the part that should stick with you. History isn't just about events. It's about perspective. Who's telling the story, what they choose to include, what they choose to leave out. And once you understand that, you stop taking narratives at face value. Now, we're about to take this one step further, because knowledge is one thing, but power decides which version of knowledge becomes dominant. And once power shifts, the story shifts with it. So the next question is simple. How did that shift happen? And what did it change? Because that's where the real turning point is. Let me ask you something real quick. Who tells the story when the power changes? Exactly, the winner. And once you understand that, you stop treating history like it's neutral, because it's not. Now, let's get straight to it. There was a moment, actually a series of moments, where Europe didn't just grow. It expanded aggressively. We're talking ships crossing oceans, new routes being opened, new territories being claimed. And that changed everything, because now it's not just about exchanging ideas anymore. Now it's about control of land, control of trade, control of resources. And once you control those three things, you don't just influence the system, you rewrite it. Now think about what that means. If you control the trade routes, you decide what moves. If you control the resources, you decide who gets rich. And if you control the narrative, you decide what people believe. That's the trifecta. And Europe locked in on all three. Now, here's where Africa comes back into focus, but not the way people expect, because Africa didn't disappear. It got pulled into a different role, a forced one. Instead of being a central player in trade networks, it started getting positioned as a source. Raw materials, labor, extraction. And when that happened, your image changes real fast. Now, instead of being seen as a place of systems and knowledge, you start getting described as something else, something less than. And that description wasn't random. It had a purpose, because if you're going to extract from a place, if you're going to take resources, take people, take wealth, you need a justification. You need a story that makes it seem acceptable. So what do? You change the narrative. You don't erase everything overnight. That would be too obvious. You shift perception gradually, strategically. You highlight certain things. You ignore others. You simplify complex histories into something easier to control. And over time, that becomes the dominant version. Now let's talk about education, because this is where it really locks in. Once a narrative makes its way into schools, into books, into institutions, it stops being questioned. It becomes fact, even if it's incomplete, even if it's biased, even if it leaves out entire sections of reality. Now imagine generations growing up learning that version. They're not going to see the gaps. They're going to assume the story is whole. That's how powerful narrative control is. Now bring it back to Africa. If the story shifts from a region with complex systems, trade networks, and knowledge, to a place that needed to be developed, that changes how the entire world sees it. And that perception sticks, even long after the original power structures change. Now here's the part people don't always connect. Because while that narrative was being built, wealth was still moving massively out of Africa into European economies, fueling growth, funding expansion, building industries. And that growth didn't happen in isolation. It was connected directly. Now think about the timing. Europe rises, builds massive global influence, industrializes, expands economically. At the same time, Africa's image is being downgraded in global perception. You don't think those two things are connected? Come on. Now let's keep it real. This isn't about saying one place did everything and another did nothing. That's not how history works. But it is about understanding imbalance. Because when one region gains power by pulling from another, and then controls the narrative about both, you get a distorted picture. Now fast forward a bit. That distorted picture becomes the default. People start thinking that's just how things always were. That one region was always ahead, another always behind. When in reality, the roles change over time, dramatically. Now here's where it hits. Because once that narrative is locked in, it doesn't just affect how people see the past, it affects how they see the present and the future. Expectations shift, assumptions form, the bias gets built into systems, all based on a version of history that left things out. Now let me bring this back to you, because this isn't just about textbooks. This is about mindset. If you grow up thinking innovation only comes from one place, you're going to look in that direction for solutions. If you think intelligence is concentrated in one region, you're going to undervalue contributions from others. That's how narratives shape reality, quietly, consistently. Now here's the shift you need to make. Stop asking, who was first? Start asking, how did things connect? Because once you track the connections, the whole story opens up. Now we're about to go deeper, because power and narrative are one thing. But the real question is, what actually got taken? Not just resources, not just labor, ideas, systems, knowledge, and how that shaped what we now call the modern world. Because once you see that clearly, you're not just looking at history anymore. You're looking at the blueprint. Everybody hears about gold. Everybody hears about land. Everybody hears about labor. Cool. But that's not the whole play. Not even close. Because if all you think got taken was physical stuff, you're missing the smarter move. What really shifts power long term? Systems, ideas, methods, the way people organize, solve problems, and build things. That's the real prize. And once that gets transferred or copied or repackaged, that's when the game changes. Now, let me make this plain. You can take resources from somewhere and get rich for a moment. But if you take systems, you get rich for generations. That's the difference. Now, think about architecture for a second. Not just building, I'm talking about techniques, design principles, how structures are planned, how they hold up, how they're scaled. Those ideas don't just appear out of thin air. They come from somewhere. And when people move through trade, through travel, through contact, those ideas move with them. Now imagine those ideas landing in a different environment. New materials, new climate, new needs. So they get adapted, modified, improved. But the foundations came from somewhere. Now fast forward, people see the final version, the refined version, and they say, that's where it started. No, that's where it got polished. Big difference. Now let's talk about agriculture, because this one is huge. You don't build wealth without feeding people at scale. You don't build cities without stable food systems. And different regions develop different techniques to deal with their environments. Crop management, irrigation, soil understanding, timing, all of that is knowledge passed down, tested, refined over generations. Now, when that knowledge gets transferred and applied somewhere else, that place benefits immediately. Now stack that with labor. Now stack that with land. You see where this is going? It's not one thing. This is layers. Now let's go even deeper, because this isn't just about physical systems. It's about mindset, problem solving under pressure, adapting to limited resources, building with constraints. That produces a certain kind of thinker, a certain kind of approach. And when that mindset enters a system, it changes how things get done. Now think about music for a second, but not just as entertainment. Think about it as structure, rhythm, pattern, expression, communication. Music isn't random, it's organized sound. And different cultures bring different structures to it. Now, when those structures spread, they influence entire industries, entire identities, entire ways people connect. Now, bring that back to the bigger picture. You've got physical systems moving. You've got intellectual systems moving. You've got cultural systems moving, all interacting, all blending, all evolving. That's how the modern world actually forms, not in isolation, through layers of exchange. Now, here's the part people don't like to sit with, because when those systems move under unequal power, when one side has control, the credit doesn't move the same way the knowledge does. Let that sink in. The knowledge travels, the influence spreads, but the recognition stops, gets redirected, reassigned. That's how you end up with ideas being associated with places they didn't originate. Now again, keep it balanced. Development still happened in multiple places. People built on what they received, advanced it, expanded it, no question. But that doesn't erase where certain foundations came from. It just adds layers on top. Now let me simplify this so it sticks. If you take a recipe, change a few ingredients, cook it differently, and then serve it somewhere else, that's still not where the idea of the dish started. It's just a new version. Same principle. Now apply that to entire systems. And now you're starting to see the scale of what we're talking about. Now here's why this matters. Because when people don't understand how systems transfer, they assume everything is original to wherever it shows up most visibly, and that's not accurate. Now let's bring it back to power again, because power doesn't just control resources, it controls visibility. What gets highlighted, what gets taught, what gets repeated. So if a system shows up in a powerful place, that's the version people see. That's the version that gets documented. That's the version that becomes official. And everything before it becomes background. Now here's the shift. Once you start tracing things backwards, instead of just looking at where they ended up, you start seeing connections everywhere. And those connections tell a different story, a fuller one. Now we're about to take it even further, because we've talked about systems. We've talked about knowledge. We've talked about power. But now we need to talk about identity. How all of this shaped the way people see themselves and each other today. Because once systems change and narratives shift, people start believing things about themselves that aren't even rooted in reality. And that might be the biggest impact of all. Let me ask you something. If you tell a lie long enough, what happens? People start believing it, not because they're stupid, because repetition is powerful. Now imagine that lie being printed in books, taught in schools, repeated in movies, repeated in documentaries, repeated by people who genuinely believe it themselves. That's not just a story anymore. That's programming. Now think about what happens when entire generations grow up hearing the same version of history. Europe discovered this. Europe invented that. Europe civilized this region. Europe led the world forward. You hear that enough times, you start accepting it as the default, even if the timeline doesn't actually support it. Now here's where identity comes into play, because history doesn't just explain the past. It tells people where they belong in the present, who built things, who discovered things, who solved big problems. That shapes how groups see themselves and how they see each other. Now imagine growing up being told your ancestors were innovators, builders, explorers. You walk through life differently. Confidence hits different. Expectations hit different. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine hearing your ancestors described mostly through struggle, through poverty, through colonization, through exploitation, even if that's only part of the story. If that's the only part you hear, that becomes your mental reference point. And that's not an accident, because perception shapes behavior. If people believe they come from builders, they build. If people believe they come from survivors, they survive. Now here's the twist. Africa's history is full of builders, engineers, scholars, traders, leaders. But if those parts of the story get minimized or ignored or pushed to the side, what happens? People forget, not just outsiders, descendants too. Now, I want you to think about how powerful that is, because you don't have to destroy a civilization's achievements physically if you erase the memory of them. If nobody knows it happened, it might as well not exist in the public mind. That's narrative power. Now let's keep it real. This didn't happen overnight. It happened over centuries, layer by layer, through books, through academia, through political influence, through cultural storytelling, and slowly, the global mental map shifted. Africa got placed in a certain box. Europe got placed in another. And once those boxes were built, people stopped questioning them. Now here's where things get interesting again, because the truth has a way of resurfacing. Information travels faster now. Researchers dig deeper now. Archaeology keeps uncovering things. Scholars keep revisiting old assumptions. And the story keeps expanding. Now suddenly, people are hearing things they weren't taught before about African kingdoms, about intellectual centers, about trade networks, about innovation that existed long before colonial systems arrived. And for some people, that's surprising, but it shouldn't be, because civilizations rise and fall in cycles. Different regions lead at different times. That's normal. What's unusual is when one version of the story gets frozen in place. Now, here's the real point. Correcting the narrative isn't about replacing one exaggeration with another. It's about balance, accuracy, context, understanding that the world was always more connected, more complex, more collaborative than the simplified version most people learned. Now bring this back to identity, because when people rediscover parts of history that were overlooked, something shifts internally. Perspective changes, possibility expands. People start asking different questions, different expectations form, and that changes the future. Now imagine millions of people worldwide re-examining history with a fuller lens, looking at Africa not just as a place of exploitation, but as a place that helped shape global systems long before modern power structures existed. That reframes everything. Now here's where it gets powerful, because once people understand that influence didn't start recently, they stop thinking of African contribution as something new. They start recognizing it as something continuous, past, present, future. And that continuity matters because it shows that innovation, leadership, and influence were never limited to one place. They moved, they evolved, they connected. Now we're about to take this even further, because identity is one thing. But the real question is, what happens when the global narrative finally starts catching up to the actual historical connections? How does that change the way the modern world sees Africa? And more importantly, how does it change the way Africa sees itself? Because that shift is already starting. And when it fully lands, the conversation about civilization might look very different from what people expected. Let me keep it real with you. You don't need a textbook to see the shift. Just look around. What people listen to, what people wear, how people talk, what trends move the fastest across the planet. That's data. Left data. And it's telling you something. Now here's what most people miss. Influence today doesn't move like it used to. It's not just governments and empires pushing ideas anymore. It's culture, it's creativity, it's speed. And when something hits, it spreads globally overnight. Now pay attention to where a lot of that influence is coming from. Music, fashion, language, digital culture. A lot of it is rooted in African and African diaspora influence. Not sometimes, consistently. Now don't brush past that, because influence is power. Different kind of power, but still power. If the world copies what you create, you're shaping how people think, how they express themselves, how they connect. That's not small. Now let's take it deeper, because this isn't just about what's trending. It's about how systems are shifting. For a long time, the gatekeepers controlled everything: media, publishing, education, distribution. If they didn't push it, it didn't spread. Simple. But now, that control is slipping because technology broke the gate. Now, anybody with a phone, a platform, and something valuable can reach the world directly. No middleman. Now, ask yourself, who thrives in environments where the rules change fast, where creativity matters more than credentials, where adaptability beats tradition? People who've been navigating pressure their whole lives. People used to building with less. People who know how to turn limitations into advantages. Now, connect that. You've got a global system shifting toward speed, toward creativity, toward innovation, toward cultural relevance, and you've got communities that have been operating in that mode already. That's alignment. That's why you're seeing influence move the way it is. Now let's talk economics for a second, but keep it simple. Attention is currency. Where attention goes, money follows. Every time. So when global attention locks onto certain styles, sounds, ideas, industries move, brands move, investments move. That's not opinion. That's how markets work now. Now think about who's driving that attention. That tells you who's shaping the future economy. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Because while all this is happening, Africa itself is changing too. Rapidly, we're talking population growth, urban expansion, tech hubs popping up, entrepreneurship rising, new markets opening, and the rest of the world is watching closely because opportunity is shifting. Now combine that with everything we talked about before. Historical influence, cultural impact, modern adaptability, and now economic growth. You're not looking at a region stuck in the past. You're looking at a region stepping into a new phase. Now let's keep it grounded. Does that mean everything is perfect? No. Challenges are real. Infrastructure gaps, political issues, economic hurdles, all of that exists. But here's the difference. The narrative is starting to change from limitation to potential. And that shift is powerful because perception drives investment and investment drives growth. Now bring it back to the global stage. You've got a world that's more connected than ever. Ideas moving instantly, cultures blending faster than ever before. And in that environment, no single region controls everything anymore. Influence is distributed, and that creates opportunity. Now here's the key point. The same connections that existed centuries ago through trade, through exchange, through movement, they never really disappeared. They just evolved. Now they're digital, faster, bigger, but still connecting the same regions. Africa, Europe, the Americas, the Middle East, all interacting, all influencing each other. But this time, more people are aware of it. More people are questioning old narratives. More people are digging deeper. Now let me say this plain. The story isn't being rewritten from scratch. It's being expanded, corrected, completed. And once that happens, you can't go back to the simplified version. Now here's what that means for the future. You're going to see more collaboration, more cross-cultural innovation, more ideas coming from places people used to overlook. Because once the world starts recognizing value in more places, it starts looking in more places. That's how growth accelerates. Now we're getting close to the final pieces because we've talked about history, we've talked about power, we've talked about identity, we've talked about modern influence. Now we need to tie it all together because the real question is simple. What does all of this actually mean for the world going forward? Not just in theory, in reality, because the next phase is already starting. And if you understand it early, you move differently. Let me say this so it sticks. You can't pick and choose which parts of the world built the modern system. That ain't how it works. Everything you see today is layered, stacked, connected. You pull one thread, something else moves. Now think about how people usually talk about history. They break it into boxes. Europe did this, Africa did that, Asia did something else. Nice and clean. Easy to remember, but it's not real because none of those places were operating in isolation. They were interacting constantly. Trade, movement, exchange, ideas bouncing back and forth like a conversation that never stopped. Now, here's where people get tripped up. They look at the final version of something and assume that's where it came from. But the final version is just the latest update, like an app on your phone. You see version 10.0, but you don't see versions 1 through 9. Those earlier versions, that's where a lot of the foundation sits. Now apply that to civilization. The systems we see today, they didn't start today. They didn't even start where they're most visible. They evolved through contact, through adaptation, through people taking what worked and building on it. Now let's make it practical. Take global cities, financial hubs, cultural centers. They look modern, but what do they rely on? Trade routes, communication networks, resource flow, all concepts that existed long before skyscrapers showed up. The scale changed, the tools changed, but the structure, same idea. Now think about culture again. Music travels, language shifts, style evolves, but it doesn't appear out of nowhere. It builds on what came before. And when you trace it back, you start seeing connections, deep ones. Now, here's the mistake people make. They try to isolate greatness like it belongs to one place, one group, one moment. But greatness doesn't stay isolated. It spreads, it influences, it gets picked up, reshaped, and passed on. That's how impact works. Now let's bring Africa back into the center of this conversation, because when you look at those early systems, trade, knowledge, cultural exchange, Africa wasn't on the outside looking in. It was part of the engine. Now fast forward to today. Different form, same principle. Influence moving, ideas spreading, connections deepening. You can't separate that. Now here's where it gets real. Because once you understand everything is connected, you stop asking who did everything and you start asking, how did everything come together? That's a better question. Now let's go even deeper. Because systems don't just connect externally. They connect internally too. Economics ties into culture. Culture ties into identity. Identity ties into behavior. Behavior ties into outcomes. It's all linked. So when one part shifts, everything else feels it. Now, think about what happens when a major influence gets overlooked, undervalued, misunderstood. The system doesn't stop working, but it doesn't work the same. It becomes incomplete. Now flip that. What happens when that influence gets recognized, developed, integrated properly? Everything levels up, faster, stronger, more adaptable. That's not theory. That's how systems behave. Now here's the part people don't always want to admit, because it challenges the clean story. The idea that the West developed completely independently doesn't hold up when you follow the connections. The idea that Africa was separate from global development doesn't hold up either. Everything overlaps. Everything interacts. Now don't twist it. This isn't about taking credit from one place and handing it to another. That's lazy thinking. This is about understanding contribution accurately, fully, without cutting pieces out. Now let me put it like this. If you build a house and 10 people contribute different parts, you don't say one person built the whole thing. You say it was a collaboration. Even if some people got more recognition than others, same principle. Now here's why this matters right now. Because we're in a moment where people are reevaluating everything. History, systems, narratives. And when that happens, old assumptions get tested. Some hold up, some don't. Now the ones that don't, they get replaced, not with something new, with something more complete. Now we're getting close to the final layer. Because once you understand the connections, Once you see how systems were built, once you recognize how narratives shaped perception, there's only one question left. What does that mean going forward? Because understanding the past isn't the goal. Using that understanding, that's where the real power is. Let me talk to you straight. If you understand that influence didn't start where people told you and didn't stay where people expected, then you should already be thinking differently right now. Not tomorrow, now. Because once you see how systems are built, you stop waiting to be included in them. You start building or stepping into the ones already shifting. That's the mindset change. Now let's break it down real simple. The world rewards value, not labels, not assumptions. Value. If you can create something people want, something people use, something people pay attention to, you're in the game. Doesn't matter where you started. Now think about everything we just talked about. Trade networks, knowledge movement, cultural influence, system building. That's all value creation. Different forms, same principle. Now bring that into today's world. You've got access to tools people didn't have before. Information, technology, platforms, distribution. You can learn faster, build faster, share faster. That changes the equation. Now, here's where most people mess up. They see the system, but they don't see where they fit in it. So they stay on the outside, watching, commenting, waiting. That's a mistake. Because systems don't wait, they move. And if you're not moving with them, you get left behind. Now let's tie this back to everything we said about perception. If you believe the story that you're supposed to be behind, you'll act like it. If you believe you're supposed to be catching up, you'll always feel late. But if you understand that contribution has always been part of your story, you move different. You're not catching up. You're continuing. That's a completely different energy. Now let's get practical again. Where's the world moving? Digital, fast, creative, global. Now ask yourself, where can you add value in that environment? Content, technology, business, ideas, collaboration. Pick a lane, then move. Now here's the real advantage. People who understand pressure adapt faster. People who've had to figure things out without perfect conditions solve problems better. That's not a disadvantage, that's training. Now, combine that with access to modern tools. That's leverage. Now, here's something people don't saw enough. You don't need permission to create value. You don't need approval to innovate. You don't need validation to build something useful. You just need to do it consistently. Now think about how many systems started small. One idea, one group, one solution, then it scales because it works. That's the pattern. Now here's where the bigger picture comes back in. If the global narrative is expanding, if more people are recognizing contributions from places that were overlooked, that creates opportunity. Because attention is shifting, investment is shifting, interest is shifting. Now, if you understand that early, you position yourself early. That's how you stay ahead. Now, let's zoom out for a second. Because this isn't just individual, this is collective too. Communities that understand their value, they organize differently, they invest differently, they build differently, because they're not operating from doubt. They're operating from awareness. Now imagine what happens when that mindset spreads across millions of people, across different countries, across different industries. That's not small. That's a shift. Now here's the part that matters most, because this is where people either level up or stay stuck. Understanding history is step one. Applying it, that's the real move. Because once you see the system clearly, you've got two choices: stay where you are or step into it. Now, let me make it even simpler. The world isn't waiting for anyone to catch up. It's moving constantly. So the question is, are you moving with it, or are you still trying to figure out where you stand? Now we're almost at the end because we've covered the past. We've connected the systems. We've looked at the present. Now we need to lock in the final point, the one thing you take away from all of this. Because if you miss that, you miss everything. Let me say this in the clearest way possible. The world didn't get built by one place. It got built by connection. That's it. That's the whole thing people keep trying to simplify. And every time somebody tries to turn it into a one-sided story, they lose the real picture. Now think about everything we just walked through. Trade moving across regions, knowledge passing between cultures, systems getting built, rebuilt, expanded, power shifting, narratives changing. None of that happens in isolation, not once. So when you hear somebody say, this group built everything, that should already sound incomplete, because it is. Now here's where it clicks. Africa's role in that story, it wasn't zero, it wasn't small. It was significant, early, connected, and ongoing. That's the part that changes how you see everything. Now, don't get it twisted. This isn't about flipping the story the other way. It's not about saying one region did everything and another did nothing. That's just the same mistake in reverse. What we're doing here is correcting the lens, making it wider, more accurate, more real. Now let me break it down in a way you can't miss. If you take Africa out of early trade networks, the system changes. If you take it out of knowledge exchange, the system changes. If you take it out of cultural influence, the system changes. That's not opinion, that's structure. Now fast forward to today. If you remove African and African diaspora influence from global culture, what happens? Music shifts, fashion shifts, language shifts, entertainment shifts, entire industries feel it immediately. That tells you something. That tells you influence is active right now, not just historical. Now here's the part people really don't sit with, because it's uncomfortable. Influence without recognition creates distortion. Let that land. When something shapes a system but doesn't get acknowledged properly, people misunderstand the system. They think it runs on something else. Now that misunderstanding spreads through media, through education, through conversation. And before you know it, the wrong version becomes normal. Now, here's why correcting that matters. Because accuracy leads to better decisions. If you understand where value actually comes from, you invest differently, you collaborate differently, you build differently. That's real world impact. Now let's bring it back to identity again, but sharper, because this is where it hits personally. If you come from a lineage of contributors, builders, innovators, and you know that clearly, you don't second guess your place in the future. You claim it naturally. Now compare that to someone who thinks their story starts from disadvantage, from being behind, from needing to catch up. That mindset limits movement before anything even starts. Now here's the truth. Both of those mindsets exist right now at the same time. Different people operating under completely different assumptions based on what they were taught. Now imagine what happens when more people shift toward the accurate version. Confidence changes, direction changes, output changes. That's not small, that's momentum. Now zoom out one last time, because this is bigger than any one group. This is about understanding how the world actually works. Connection over isolation, contribution over ownership, evolution over origin. That's the real framework. Now here's the final piece before we close this out. because everything we've talked about leads to one conclusion. If the system was built through connection and continues to run through connection, then the future belongs to the people who understand how to connect, create, and contribute. That's it. Not the loudest, not the most hyped, the most effective. Now think about where you fit into that. Not where somebody told you to fit. Where you actually add value. That's your position. Now we're about to wrap this up. And I'm going to leave you with something you won't forget. Because if you understand that, you don't just see history differently. You move differently every day. Let me talk to you like I would if we were standing face to face. All this history, all these connections, all this truth getting uncovered, it ain't just for debate, it's for direction. Because once you really understand what we just broke down, you stop asking small questions. You stop thinking small. Now here's the core of it. The world you see today, it wasn't built in straight lines. It was built in layers. And African influence is one of those layers, a major one, not the only one, but not optional either. Now, if something is built into the foundation, you can't act like it's extra. You can't treat it like decoration. You can't ignore it and still understand the structure. That's the mistake people keep making. They look at the surface and think they're seeing the whole thing. Nah, they seeing the paint, not the frame. Now let's make this personal, because that's where it actually matters. If you understand that your history is tied to contribution, to influence, to shaping systems, then your mindset shifts immediately. You don't walk into rooms wondering if you belong. You walk in knowing you've always been part of the build. That's a different energy, and people feel that. Now let's keep it balanced. This ain't about ego. This ain't about walking around like you're better than anybody. That's not the move. The move is awareness, clarity, understanding your position without needing validation. That's power, quiet power. Now here's the other side of it. Because this message ain't just for one group, it's for everybody. If you're building something, anything, and you don't understand how different influences shape the system you're working in, you're operating blind. You're missing pieces, important ones. Now, imagine trying to fix something without understanding how it was built. You might get lucky, but most of the time, you're guessing. That's what a lot of people are doing right now. Guessing. Because they don't have the full picture. Now, here's what changes when you do. You make better decisions. You see opportunities earlier. You avoid mistakes other people keep making. Because you understand the system deeper than surface level. Now let's bring it back to the big idea one last time. If it wasn't for Africa, the Western world would be nothing. That's a strong statement. But now you understand what it actually means. It's not about saying one place did everything. It's about recognizing that key parts of what we call the Western world didn't develop in isolation. They were influenced, connected, shaped by interactions that go back way further than most people realize. That's the real takeaway. Now here's the part I want you to carry with you after this ends. Don't let simplified stories limit how you see the world or yourself, because the truth is always more complex, more connected, more interesting than the version most people get. Now let's get real practical for a second. When you move forward from here, move with awareness. If you're creating, create like you're adding to a long line of innovation, because you are. If you're learning, learn like you're uncovering layers that were always there, because you are. If you're building something, build like you understand the system is bigger than what you see, because it is. Now here's the final truth. The future isn't about who was first. It's about who understands the system well enough to move it forward. That's where we are right now. A world where information is opening up, where narratives are being challenged, where connections are becoming visible again. And in that world, the people who win are the ones who see clearly, think clearly, and move with purpose. That's it. No mystery, no secret formula, just clarity and action. Now I'm going to leave you with this. History ain't just something you watch, but something you continue. Every decision you make, every idea you build, every move you take, you adding to it. So the question isn't just what happened before you, it's what you're going to do with that knowledge now, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you understand it, you don't move the same ever again.